brain. So obviously your labs, you should have put those in last night at the latest. A few people got extensions and that's fine. I will be splitting those up with Joe and hopefully we'll get them marked relatively quickly. I'd like to get you're first in the queue. So I have 3 exams coming up this week in other classes, but you're first in line, so you get first dibs at marking. So hopefully we'll get those done. I'm hoping within a week and a half. Depends on how much time we end up having. So hopefully we'll get those back to you pretty quickly and we can work it through. Midterm marks should be up for everybody. I finished marking them this morning at 8:30 roughly. So those are up. Class average was about 75%, which is about where I expect things to be. That's pretty normal for this class. So, I mean, if you have any concerns, if you want to come and take a look at what you got wrong on the multiple choice or the short answer and have me talk you through it, absolutely feel free to book an appointment. I'm also here all day tomorrow, pretty much from 9:30 to 3:30. So you can come into the office and, if you want to have a look. Mostly, I thought pretty good. A few kind of challenges with operationalization was probably the biggest one on the short answer. Everything else seemed pretty much where I expect it to be. So all good, I think. Trying to think if there's anything. Oh, there's a lab tomorrow, I believe. Yes. Joan, what do you think? No. Okay. The lab tomorrow. Where you're going to start working on the major lab, like the mini labs, obviously, but then the major lab number 2, the one that's qualitative in nature. So we're going to kind of try to work through that over the next few weeks. And we're pretty close now to the end, right? Like, how many weeks are there left? 5 weeks left, I think. So we're doing pretty good. Okay. So any questions before I jump in? Like, I've blabbered on, spent 5 minutes talking about myself and all that. Yeah, please.
I just have a question about the submission for the major lab.
Okay.
So it's kind of personal, but I submitted it at 11:59, and it said I was over time.
I don't know why it doesn't. Maybe it's the clock on E-class is 1 minute ahead or something. Honestly, I would never nitpick that little of time. It's like 20 seconds -1 grade point. I'm looking for ways to lower your averages. That's what it's obviously I wouldn't do that. So yeah, E-class might have a slightly different time than the rest of the world. Who knows? Maybe that's why it's being sent into gentle retirement by literally blowing it up sometime next year. So I guess fall 2025, it's still got lots of time. It's still got another year or so. Yeah, they're replacing it with Canvas. It's another learning management software tool. It's ugly. It had that 2003 feel to it. Those smooth 2003 lines. Yeah. I actually did like the old Bear Tracks much more than the new one because you could actually find stuff, and the new one is completely useless. Which I think that's honestly, it's not going to help any of you, but I'm sure Bear Tracks is next on the slate of things the university needs to blow up. What's that? Oh, of course they will, because they make everything worse. Let's do renovations. Somehow you made this space worse. Yes, that was our intention. We want your lives to suck. That's what we wanted. So we succeeded, you say. Yeah. And when they did the visual improvement to E-class, though it was ugly before, they somehow did make it worse. Now it's harder to find things. So it's good. Everything the university does. And you know what the funny thing is? They spent all that money and time putting a new coat of paint on E-class only to then decide a year later that they should just blow it up. So it's like, why? Why didn't you just leave it the way it was, save that money and spend it on something else? I don't know. Why is that person staring at me? Oh, they're gone now. Okay. Weird. And disconcerting. Nothing germane to the course. Okay. But yes, Canvas they're bringing it in. It's the best-selling learning management software in the world, apparently. So I'm sure it'll work perfectly well. Okay, so what were we talking about? Okay, I guess we started talking about, like, we started on, take a deep breath and slow down. Okay. All right. I will never, ever schedule 4 classes in a day ever again as long as I live, plus office hours between the 3 classes and this one. Never again am I doing this to myself because it makes me a scattered wreck. What's that? So I still work 3 days, but I'm here on Tuesday anyway. So I teach 3 days a week, but yeah, 2 days a week I have 3 or 4 classes in a day. And then Friday I have 3 classes back to back because I'm a masochist and I hate myself. So that's where. What's that? Let's all go. No, you must learn now, Joan. You must learn. All right. So we were talking about qualitative research. So we've started, kind of describing what it looks like, some of the criteria, some of the methods, the path, especially kind of a grounded theory approach. Okay. So this, I don't know why I chose this graphic. Oh, qualitative research. What society thinks I do. Really, they're homeless, apparently. Okay, so one of the goals, right, with qualitative research is to generate what's called an empathic understanding. So basically, trying to see a social circumstance, right? Whatever it is you happen to be trying to figure out through the eyes of your research subject, right? So you're trying to sort of empathize with them, especially if you're doing something like participant observation or interviews, right? You're trying to empathize with them at the end of the day. You're trying to see what they see, understand what they understand, see through their eyes, at least to some extent. That is at least kind of the goal of qualitative research. And yeah, the product that you come out with, so we talked about thick descriptions last time, I think on the one slide before this. No, the slide, no, I thought it was on, anyway, I don't remember where it was. Thick, 3 slides back, right? Thick descriptions of particular circumstances. What we mean by that is really detailed descriptions of, context. Emphasis on context, basically trying to tell the story in as much of your research participants and what's happening in their lives, how they interpret it, in as much detail as possible, right? So gathering as much detail as you can. So yeah, behavior that can seem odd or irrational sometimes becomes more understandable within a particular social context. You can come to understand why people do certain things if you can see it through their eyes, and if you describe it well enough, other people can as well. And naturalism, almost like the reason that if people want to observe nature, they use like closed circuit cameras that they nail to a tree, right? It's the same kind of approach with social research in some senses. You want to not disturb the social context, right? The natural social context going on. Social researchers, especially qualitative ones, want to make sure that the social context is as natural as it can be, so that you always want to minimize your impact on what is going on in a particular social environment. So you observe people in their own environment, especially if you're doing something like participant observation, forms of ethnography, trying to get a sense of what they're like in, when they're at their most normal, right? When they're at their most, like acting just like themselves in normal everyday life. Okay. Okay. I need more latte. Hang on. So another kind of part of a thick description in kind of giving those detailed accounts is an emphasis on process. You want to, show or explain in your research how things ultimately kind of change or evolve over time. And you want to give a really, really good sense of this. So again, when I was doing my research on Russian TV, right, one of the things that I did in my kind of thick description was I went back, oh my God, I have post-traumatic stress syndrome about my dissertation. What's that? Isn't it, sorry? Oh, I don't know. What did I say? Oh, yeah, you're probably right. I have post-traumatic stress about my misuse of post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress disorder, yes. PTSD, not PTSS. Oh, maybe I'll come up with a new one and I'll put it in the DSM-6. It's like what happens to former grad students after they have to talk about their dissertation. What was I saying? Oh, Joan, you've distracted me again. Now I have to take a now, right now I have to take another sip of my latte to regather my own thoughts. The second cup, unfortunately, their lattes are really terrible. Not that nearby. I'd have to go outside. What are you trying to do? They're all just trying to get rid of me. It's like, tell me. So can you tell me without telling me that you don't want to be here? Like, I'm not gonna lie to you, Professor Prasad. I'd rather be almost anywhere else. Back surgery sounds good right about now. Oh. Okay, that's fun. It's nice to have a rapport with your students, even if it reveals that they hate you. Okay, so, right, one of the things I did, right, in terms of my dissertation was I went back to like the 1990s. So I mean, I'm writing this in the 2010s. I went back to the 1990s and figured out what was happening and kind of gave a history of, the changes in the Russian TV industry since, basically the end of the Soviet Union. And I gave some Soviet context as well. But basically, right, you're trying to establish, how patterns evolve over time. How did you get to this particular place? Well, okay, is the process of looking at it. So if you were, say, in a social situation, right, if you're doing something like an ethnography where you're doing participant observation, you might spend a long time in the field, right, with participants, interacting with them, seeing the world through their eyes, and you would start to see how their social context unfolds as well. And you can describe that process. Again, this is mostly for like research where you're with people for a long time, or you're talking about relatively long time spans. You can do these kinds of thick descriptions that describe context and how things kind of how things proceed over time. I suppose you could do this for shorter things as well. You could go to the furry convention and see how people connect with each other, and the process of choosing, I don't know, getting into character, going to the convention. You could talk about that process as well in shorter ways. Okay, yeah, you can also do this with semi-structured or unstructured interviewing approaches, where you do something like a life history approach, right, where you ask people about their life, you ask them to tell you their story, and you describe how their life sort of evolved over the course of several years. Okay, the other thing, you can do it with content analysis as well, right? You can describe, histories and how things changed, how texts came to be, how texts, the way texts are produced have changed over time. You can do this process emphasis in lots of ways in qualitative research. Hello.
So whenever you do the background, what takes precedence, like talking to the people and what they deem to be their background, or do you want to do both? You want to do external and internal?
That's I don't know that I ever thought about it that way. So you'd have to make a judgment as a researcher, because there are going to be instances. So people's story of how things progress for them is definitely important, right? So if you're doing like or semi-structured interviewing, and you're asking people about their life and they're giving you their life history, you definitely would want to talk about that, because that's their interpretation of how their life unfolded, right? Or how an event unfolded. And that's important because that's their perspective. That's how you understand what they're thinking. There is a case to be made too, though, and this is a problem with people generally, is that people don't always have a really good sense of the objective, right? Like, because people only see partially, right? You only see your own life. And so you can misconstrue things, you can misunderstand things, you can have an incorrect sense of what was going on at the time. If you're interviewing 10 people, everybody might have a slightly different account of things. So having that broader view and then kind of putting in context people's experiences within, say, I don't want to say objective because there's not a truly objective history, but something that's attempting to be a little bit more of an objective history is also really valuable, right? And sometimes you want to do both because, yeah, people get stuff wrong all the time because we're all stuck in our little trench, right? I see my own life and that's all I see. I don't necessarily see the whole world. And so if you can put that slice of life into the context of a broader kind of what's going on narrative, I think that's how I would do it. And that's sort of what I've done, although until you asked me, I wouldn't have ever like articulated it that way. But yeah, I think both of them are valuable and they're both important, and they both help, sorry, tripping over my tongue, help to establish that broader context. Sorry, does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, so I'm giving you a both and question to your either or sort of framing. Right, I moved forward. Okay, all right. So what you'll be doing tomorrow in the lab, right, is you're going to be formulating a research question. I also enjoy qualitative research. It's a terrible dad pun, but I'm absolutely owning that thing. I didn't make it. I found it online, but I loved it so much. And I still do. I put this in like a few years ago. I still love it. Okay, so questions, right? When you formulate a research question qualitatively, it should remain pretty general. You don't want to over-specify it. And again, one of the things you're probably going to end up doing as, because we are talking about an inductive and more iterative process. So you're going to have a chance as you go through the process of your research of refining your research question. I mean, honestly, it's not uncommon to start a research project, gather a bunch of data, start analyzing it, and be like, oh, actually, that's what I really want to know about, right? You find something in your kind of gathering of information, and you're like, oh, this is the really interesting thing, right? This happened to me when I was doing my master's, again, on Russian TV. I'm sorry to use Russian TV as an example all the time. But I had this idea going in, I was going to look at news in Russia, and I was going to do an analysis of the news media and all of this stuff. And I started as, I think part of my coursework, doing actual research on it and looking into Russian TV, watching a whole bunch of it. And then I started watching Russian sitcoms for some reason. And I was like, oh, actually, this is really interesting. So, I mean, you start with, I had started with a pretty general question as like, how is the state kind of shaping what happens on Russian TV? And then it was like, oh, okay. And then I refined it down to fictional television, right? So I started with sitcoms and then I worked into some other things. So, especially early in your research, right? Especially I think as a master's or even a PhD student, you often start with a really general question, right? And then you're going to refine it down as you go out and gather data, talk to people, do some content analysis, all of that fun kind of interviews or participant observation, right? Come with me and we hang out at the furry convention over the weekend. It's funny, I was going through my USRI data for like the last 5 years because I need to grab some student comments. And I found one particular comment that said, Professor Broussard, I'm not entirely convinced that you aren't secretly a furry. I just broke Joan. But that's neither here nor there. And then, a positive comment. It made me laugh, and I thought it was kind of funny. So anyway, it was good times. Anyway, I don't know why I brought that up, but it just made me laugh. I was talking about furries, and I distracted myself. But yeah, you're gonna, as you interact with people, you may refine down your question, and you're probably gonna find some phenomenon, within the broader sort of topic that you're interested in that's more interesting to you, and that's a little bit more researchable. So if you're writing your research question with Joe tomorrow and working on Minilab 4, don't worry about the fact that your question might seem quite general, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. And like if you were actually doing the project, you'd refine it down over time. Yeah, generally, as opposed to quantitative research, there's not a lot or very little or no theory driving the research at first. That's going to come later, right? The topics explored in the research might change as the study progresses, right? This is what I'm talking about. As you kind of locate the things that are actually interesting. And sometimes, honestly, we have a really bad sense of what's going to be interesting. So you start out on a research topic. Now, at the master's level, you can't do this too often, where you're going to have a 5-year master's and then you're going to have spent 5 years doing something that should take 2 or 1.5. But it's not uncommon, right, to kind of change your topic a few times or refine it down because you're finding the thing that you're actually really interesting or where there's a wealth of data, right? Sometimes the thing you thought had a wealth of data really doesn't. So yeah, be open to change. It can change as time goes on. And yeah, if you're too rigid, and I've seen this with a few students over time, if you're too rigid in kind of what your research question is, sometimes you run aground on the fact that maybe there's not that much interesting going on that you can talk about. And you just can't, or you can't find the angle, right? And sometimes research is actually, especially where you're trying to get funding, research is about finding an angle, something that's interesting, something that makes it unique and different, and something that hasn't been talked about a million times. When I was talking about news coverage in Russia, this had been looked at a million times. There was nothing interesting to say, right? People had said it all, and better than I was ever going to say it. But pretty much no one had ever taken the time to write about Russian sitcoms. Most of them were pretty bad, but for reasons, although one of them remains one of my favorite shows ever for totally personal reasons. But it's called Kuchnia. The kitchen. It translates as the kitchen. You can find it on the first episode of it on my YouTube channel because I actually subtitled the first episode so I could show it in class. It took me 2 weeks to translate and subtitle it myself in Windows Movie Maker because it's the best video editing software I had available at the time. It was not a good video editor. It was pretty terrible, but nevertheless, I have it. It's on my YouTube channel somewhere or other. Okay. The kitchen. Oh, classic show. For me, not for you. For Russians, all of my Russian friends all know exactly what I'm talking about. All of you are deeply confused. Okay, so main goal of qualitative research, so seeing through the eyes of others, bringing out that sense of process, having a flexible and unstructured method of inquiry, right? It's generally much less rigid than quantitative. Getting a deep understanding of the people or groups being studied. Trust me, there's probably nobody outside of a few other specialist academics that know more about Russian TV than I do, more than I ever wanted to know or should know. It helps me vibe with like old Russians who live here. It's really fun because they all have watched the same shows as I have. Like I'm saying old, like in their 40s and 50s. They've all watched the same shows. So it's always fun times. Pursue social justice and bring about social change. Maybe, if you want to be, if you're an activist researcher and that's part of your agenda. Okay, so I love the slide design on here. I did a nice job. Okay, so admiring my work from a few years ago. Qualitative research, there's this long-standing quant-qual kind of battle in the social sciences because each of them fundamentally sort of disrespects the other. So what are the critiques of qualitative research? Well, I mean, the first one that you can probably imagine, it's very subjective. Right? I think I mentioned this last class, is that qualitative research can be super subjective at times. There's just like these big periods where, it is a lot down to your interpretation as the researcher, as the person putting the account together, as to what you think is going on. And so a lot of times, right, it can be too subjective. Sometimes people think that ideology is kind of injected into a lot of social research. It can be impressionistic and too subjective, right? So just based on your impressions of what's going on. When you get to like or participant observation and ethnography, there are moments where people have suggested that a lot of qualitative research might actually result from personal relationships that develop during the research, right? If you're interacting with people, right? If I go to live my life among the furries. It might be that I make friends with a bunch of furries, right? And I start to like them. And then maybe I don't want to portray them in a negative light. I don't want to be too honest about them, right? I want to, I'm not saying there's terrible things to report about the furries. As we've established, I'm not a furry, and I really don't know. And please don't say otherwise on the spots. But you could end up being biased towards people, and this happens frequently, right? It's hard to criticize your friends, and it's hard to even speak the truth about your friends, especially if you think you might present the research and they're going to see it, and then they might be insulted. It doesn't even have to be your friends, even just acquaintances or people that you like mildly care about. So it can be subject to this. It could be unclear as to how a particular topic or theme became the focus of research. Oh, trust me, when I was trying to explain to my parents how I ended up talking about Russian sitcoms in large part, they were like, how did that happen? I'm like, I don't know, it was interesting. And they're like, but why? Yeah, it can be unclear as to how you arrive at a particular research topic. But yeah, too subjective, right, is the big one on this. Like generally, the fact that it's just your interpretation of what's going on. And in a lot of cases, you're the one kind of putting together, the quotes, the data, the observations, right? It's all linked to your personal observations in some way. Okay, so it is extremely difficult to replicate. And this is, I think we talked in the first part of the course about the replication crisis in general. A lot of qualitative research is just impossible to replicate, right? You would never be able, you could reproduce the methodology, right? Although even then, it can be a real challenge. You can replicate sort of the general methodology, but you're never going to be, the chance that you're going to get the same access. The social setting will have changed too, because new people will enter, people will die, people will leave. So it's not exactly the same study. So they are really, really difficult to replicate. The project that my boss is working on right now is it's looking at kind of prisoners and reentry and all the issues that people have coming back into society after being incarcerated. It's a really interesting project. One of the really interesting kind of methodological things that's been going on is they've been trying to take some of the other projects that are similar to this that have been done in the past. Very specifically from David Pyrus, he's at University of Colorado, and he's done these kind of studies in the US. And Sandra and David are friends. And so she went to David and she's like, hey, how did you do this landmark study on US prison reentry? And he described the process, and it was like, sorry, I laugh because it was like, my boss's comment was, that's fucking insane. He hired private investigators to do background checks into particular inmates. And it was like, okay, that would never pass ethics here. How did it pass ethics in Colorado? Right? It's absolutely fucking insane. I completely agree. And following his methodology has been, how to describe it, a flustercluck, if you will. It's caused endless problems, both the technical and administrative level. Anyway, it's really hard to replicate. It was a groundbreaking study. It was insane though too. The Colorado Department of Corrections was literally uploading their data onto his server daily. And it was like, I don't think corrections in Alberta is going to do that. I don't think that's how it works here. Anyway, so replicability on qualitative stuff can be really, really hard. So difficult because social contexts are so different, and in this case, Colorado and Alberta are miles apart, not just physically. Though I drove to Colorado this summer, and there's a whole bunch of Wyoming between here and there that's very empty and full of antelope, and not very interesting to drive through. The most interesting things were gas stations, and that's saying something, and a Burger King that I'm pretty sure gave me food poisoning, which I think, what's that? Oh, I know. There's a whole story behind why we ate at Burger King. It involves my wife leaving her purse, which contained our passports and all of our US cash, at a roadside ice cream stand in Montana run by Amish people, which involved me making a 280-mile return trip the next day. So that was fun. And her staying at the Airbnb with our 3 kids trying to kill time. Either way. The Amish were very nice and they did not steal anything. They just held it there. And I'm like, wow, this is not the America I was told exists. This is a different America, an Amish America. Anyway, I don't remember what I was saying. Social context, very different, right? Colorado and Alberta, very different. And sometimes it's hard to replicate things. It's hard to replicate studies, even things that should be fairly straightforward, talking to the same people, really, really, really difficult. So you can kind of copy methodologies, but it's not always possible to really say that you replicated the study. Okay, and yeah, reactive effects can be expected. And so anytime, like this is especially true of, say, participant observation or any kind of ethnography, you just being there is causing some kind of effect. And one of the things you cannot control for is the different reactive effects that different researchers attempting to do the same research are going to generate, right? Someone's going to react very different to me than they are to my boss or any other researcher trying to do the same thing. Okay, and generalization is really, really, really difficult when it comes to qualitative research. Why? Because you're generally talking about you're not ever, and if you do this on your major lab too, I will warn you, if you give me a probability sample for qualitative research that involves 1,500 or 400 interviews, I will mark you down. Why? Because it's never going to happen in qualitative research, right? Outside of you having like a giant research team, so when you're a full professor at, University of Toronto and you have 20 grad students, maybe. But on this project, you don't have a representative sample. You don't have a probability sampling. So you can't really generalize, right? You're getting a very tiny slice of life. For like a master's PhD project, you're probably talking about, say, interviews with 20 to 40 people at most, and you can't generalize that. It's not a big enough sample. And if you haven't done randomization, you're not going to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you, but I'm warning you. Qualitative sampling is different. Don't use quantitative sampling techniques on qualitative research. It doesn't work. And I will tell you what works if you come to class or watch the videos. But don't just take I'm going to do simple random sampling on my interviews and I'm going to interview 500 people because unless you have a decade, that's never going to work. Okay. But yeah, basically generalization is really hard. Sample sizes are pretty small for the most part, outside of the really good, really national studies with huge research teams, but that's not what you're going to be doing, especially at the beginning of your career. So I would say don't aim for that. And you're not going to get generalizability. Now again, often we're looking for a thick description of a particular social circumstance, and generalization may not be the goal. The thing you might be looking for is a few principles that you can suggest might be applied to other social contexts. Okay. So, lack of transparency, another critique of it, is that a lot of qualitative research can potentially lack transparency. It can be difficult to determine how the research was conducted. It's the job of the researcher to sort of tell you in a methodology section how the research was conducted and give you some kind of rationalization for why it was done the way it was. Why certain people were chosen for in-depth interviews, etc. Why certain locations or places were the places that you ended up going. Again, it's not necessarily a problem, but sometimes, again, when we talk about qualitative sampling, a lot of it is convenience samples. So it's why were certain people chosen for in-depth interviews? Because they would talk to me. Because no one else would, and they would talk to me. And that's why I talk to this person, right? That can be, one of the reasons. Now, is that the greatest justification ever? No. But it's what a lot of qualitative research ends up coming down to, because you need access, and access is really, really difficult. Why did you choose certain texts, right? If you're doing qualitative work that involves textual analysis, why this and not that? Why did you study this? Why did you not study that? You should try to spell it out in the methodology section, but sometimes you just don't, right? Sometimes it can be unclear why this and not that. Okay, unclear how you arrived at specific findings. Hopefully not. I mean, if you're doing your job correctly in your thick description, you should be pretty clearly saying how you came to specific findings. But sometimes, you know, people don't write it out really well. Not everybody's a great writer. Oh my God, I've been reading journal articles. I hadn't read a bunch of journal articles, and especially in education-related fields. And half of them, I swear, were not written in English. I swear they were Google translated. They are terrible. And one of them, in their abstract, used the word nowadays. And it made me want, like, I cringed physically. And this was published in, like, a mid-range journal, and it had nowadays. And I'm like, that hurts me. Stop it. You could do it in class, but if you do it in an academic journal, the editor should be like, no, none of that. I have no problem with people using it. It's just like not academic language nowadays. I was reading the abstract, and I was like, I'm not even going to read the rest of this paper, because if nowadays is in the abstract, I'm done. I'm done with you. I can't do it. I'm trained to not use even contractions in my academic writing. So, what's that? It's not proper English. It's not the King's English or whatever. I don't know. It's how we do it. It's deeply drilled into me. I've been in the academy too long. Please send me bags of money so I can escape. Just trying for that lottery ticket. All right. I've never bought a lottery ticket, and I don't even know how. Okay. Yeah, can be diminished by researchers keeping detailed. Yeah, so, you know, all of this, you know, these lack of transparency. If you keep detailed records, so we'll talk about field notes when we talk about ethnography. You use them for interviews. You use them for ethnographies. Field notes are really, really important. They can help and show a little bit more transparency so that if you're ever audited, you know, that process we talked about, people can see how you came to certain conclusions. Really good description, you know, me writing it really well and explaining how you found these things out can also be really, really useful. Okay. I mean, okay, I got a couple slides left. Very quickly, you know, in terms of contrast between quant and qual, qual is all about words, whereas quant is all about numbers, right? The quality of things versus the quantity of things. Sometimes quantitative research we think of as from the point of view of the researchers, whereas qualitative is from the point of view of the participants. As a qualitative researcher, you tend to be much closer to the research subject. You're talking with actual people, not just dealing with numbers or running surveys. You develop, obviously it's inductive, you develop your theories from the data. Tends to be pretty unstructured. And that's why it's fun. I've done quantitative research. It's never quite as fun as qualitative research, because qualitative research is kind of wild and wacky, and it changes, and you're being very adaptive, and you're sort of, you know, thinking on your feet, constantly reacting to things that are happening. You know, you're in the middle of a research project on Russian TV, and then Putin invades Crimea, and all sorts of things go crazy. Life is fun. You have more of a contextual understanding rather than generalizable knowledge. And you tend to develop theories rather than testing theories. You have rich, deep data as opposed to like objective data. You tend to be really worried about meaning rather than behavior, and less worried about something like an artificial setting, like a survey or an experiment, and much more into natural settings. Okay, I'm out of slides. But I'm not actually out of slides, because I have endless slides. I'm just out of slides for this subject, because I can go to the next one, if I can find it. And we can start talking about ethnography. Da, 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 da. I'm really sorry, Joan. I can see you for a second. You're like, well, you're out of slides. I guess it's time to go home. I make it sound like you hate me, and yet you come to class every single day. Okay, so ethnography. Right. So what is ethnography, right? So one of the, outside of interviews, right? And we talk about qual methods. ethnography is like method number 2 in terms of qualitative research. So maybe there's one spot that echoes right as I'm walking by it. So yeah, it's probably the second biggest methodology when we talk about qualitative methods. And it's really about, it kind of pioneered, I think, in anthropology, and it's been ported over into sociology to try and understand things that are going on in our own society. So yeah, I mean, it's basically study of people and their culture in naturally occurring settings, right? So generally involves going out and being in whatever social settings people are in, and observing them, seeing what's happening, and describing them. Yeah, so you observe it in unstructured ways, right? So if you remember in the first part of the course, right, the last thing we did before reading week, wow, that feels like a long time ago, was structured observation, right, which is a very kind of detailed and structured form of observing behavior. Ethnography is sort of, I don't know, the flip side of the coin of that. It's observing people in a very unstructured way, right? So you do things by being with people, carrying out in-depth discussions, right? You talk to people, you interview them, or just by being around in certain social circumstances and observing what's happening. The goal being, describe what's happening in a community from the point of view of participants. And this can be anything, right? Some of the funnest of these are people hanging out with street gangs and figuring out what the heck is happening with this street gang. Like, what is the process that is going on? Who are these people? What is it that they're doing? All of this stuff, right, is very much what happens in ethnography. It's just, and it can, like I said, it can be any group. It can be anything from the furries at the furry convention to the Hells Angels. And all of this kind of research has been done in terms of people hanging out with these different groups. And yeah, generally it's immersive, right? You immerse yourself in particular social settings for long periods of time, sometimes years. Sometimes years. So it can go a long time. Okay. So participant observation. Sometimes people draw, like, they'll have ethnography / participant observation, in the sense that they're kind of trying to differentiate between ethnography and participant observation. Participant observation tends to be a part of ethnographies. They're essentially synonymous, except that sometimes ethnography, what typically happens is participant observation ends up being one sort of method within an ethnography. And ethnographies can include other things as well. And particularly, ethnographies will often include interviews, right? Or some kind of textual analysis. And this is the kind of chaos of, I think, qualitative research in general, is often you're mixing and matching a lot of qualitative methods because you're trying to get that thick description, right? Because you want a thick description, you're turning to a lot of forms of data. So often in an ethnography, you want as much data as possible about what's going on in that social context, and participant observation ends up being just one piece of an ethnography. So what's confusing maybe about this is it's not an ethnography if you don't have participant observation, right? If you don't have participant observation, you're just doing interviews, or you're just doing interviews and content analysis or whatever, you're doing something else. You're not doing participant observation. You're not doing ethnography, you're doing something else. So you can't have ethnography without participant observation, but participant observation isn't exhaustive of ethnography, right? Ethnographies can include more than one methodology. Yeah, so that's my second point, right? Can include interviews, documents, artifacts from the community. Ethnography also, yes, okay, this is where words have multiple meanings. An ethnography, so when you talk about an ethnography, you're almost always talking about the account you write. So I wrote this ethnography or this ethnographic account. of what was going on at the furry convention, right? That also is kind of what an ethnography is. The account that you give, that's an ethnography as well. So it can be a little bit confusing. It's not it's not a research term, so we don't have to worry about it in that sense. But if you'll see it sometimes, that someone did an ethnography of Polynesian, indigenous people or something like that, right? Okay, I already said the anthropology part. Emma?
So just to clarify, so in order to have an ethnography, you have minimum participant observation.
Yes, yeah. So there's no ethnography without participant observation. If you're not doing participant observation, you're doing something else.
And you can have more.
Yeah, so you can add methods to participant observation and make your ethnography bigger, bolder, brighter, but you can't subtract participant observation and still say you're doing an ethnography. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, you're okay.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
People are dead, and you go.
If sorry, people.
People are dead. And
Okay.
you just go through your journals and stuff. And you
That is, I would tend to think of that as a type of content analysis, because you're not actually like. I know what you mean, because sometimes people do what's called like a people's history, right? I remember a few years ago it was like on CBC Hockey, a people's history, and they gathered a bunch of historical documents, and it was like Joe from Scarborough wrote a letter to his wife about how he won the big hockey tournament in Sudbury, and they read it out loud in a dramatized voice. That's really more of a content analysis or a historiography than it is participant observation. But yeah, so you're still getting, in a sense, I guess you're still trying to get people's perspectives. Because you weren't immersed in it, it's not an ethnography. Okay, can I tell you a weird one that people did? And one of my colleagues did this, and I could never quite wrap my head around it because it never made sense to me, which was she did an autoethnography of herself. So it was her story of playing video games. So she recorded herself playing video games and called it an autoethnography. And I can't hold back my contempt because I was just like, how is that academic research? You're researching you. Who cares? I'm like, what? I don't remember. I'd have to go read it. I was so dismissive of it at the time that I'm most I guess she tracked her life history and how games had helped her deal with something or other, which I think was the technical term. This helped her deal with something or other. I'm always shocked when I see some of these really novel methodologies like, I'm immersed with myself. I'm like, you're always immersed with yourself. You're not immersed with anything else. How is this a research? How did you get funding for this? Please tell me so I can do an ethnography of teaching intro to social methods. My autoethnography where I recorded myself, which I do all the time anyway, teaching this class. What's that? I have the data. It's already there. I have years of data of me teaching this class. So. My secret furry identity has come out. I am Tom the Fox. That is who I am. No, I'm kidding. Oh, this is so showing up on the spot somewhere. Oh dear. Okay. I've run that joke absolutely into the ground for years, and I'm not going to stop. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm done with this slide. I'm done with this slide. Autoethnography. Silly. Oh, Gandalf. Okay. Inevitably, if you ever do ethnographic research, you are going to run into a Gandalf the Grey telling you the equivalent of, not actually, but telling you shall not pass. Yeah, access to the field of research in ethnography can be really, really difficult once you get into here, right? Once you get into closed settings, it can be really difficult. Without it, you obviously can't carry out the research, but it's not always, just because you want to be somewhere and you have an academic interest does not mean that people are just going to open the door for you. Okay, so open settings are the easiest, right? Open or public settings, public parks, downtown, sidewalks, places where people, there's no barriers to being there. You're allowed to be there because you're a member of the public. You can make observations, but it's difficult to get really deep accounts, right? Because it might be hard to talk to people. People might not want to talk to you, and all sorts of things. Closed settings, much, much harder. Why? Because there are, there are obviously boundaries. There are insiders, outsiders. There are people who will talk to you, people who won't talk to you. We had a guest speaker a couple weeks ago, Randall Contreras, who's at UC Riverside. He gave an interesting talk. So he's studying Maravillas, which are these Latino gangs in LA. And it was interesting because he wanted to talk to these people, and he is Latino himself. He's from the Dominican. And so he thought, he would have no problem kind of getting access to this particular research site. And it turned out like people would not talk to him. Why? Because at being Dominican, they coded him as black, right? And not Latino. It's like, you're black, you're not Latino. And they didn't like black people for, whatever reasons they didn't like black people. I think rival gangs and such things. So, he ran into a sort of closed setting. They had all of these social places like community centers where they hung out and they talked, but he couldn't get access to them. And then, he had someone introduce him, and how did he tell it? It was really funny. He's like, she made sure, she's like, I'll get you in. And she's like, first you have to cut your hair. So he shaved his head. He said it made him look a little bit more like stereotypically Latino. And the person who introduced him, she said, I'm really going to roll the R. So she's like, it's Randall Contreras, right? To like upsell how Latino he was. And that got him into this particular setting. Otherwise, he was not going to get into, these community centers where the Maravillas hung out, just because they didn't trust him, right? So it wasn't until he could gain that trust that he was able to get in. Before that, it was all Gandalf, you shall not pass, or more, we are not interested in talking to you, get the hell out of here. Okay, yeah, please. Oh, go ahead.
You know how you said initiation things? So let's say you want to go to a group, right?
Okay.
You have to show your commitment and that you're going to take part in this, whatever, and that you trust is no public. Just like, how can you do illegal things?
No. Don't do illegal things to do research. Also, and this is advice from not my direct supervisor, but Kevin Haggerty's chair of the department, and he said, as they were training the new grad students, he's like, inevitably when you deal with, incarcerated populations, someone is going to ask you some version of the following question. Could you just hold on to this for me for a little while? And whatever, a package or whatever. And the answer to that question has to always be no. Because, he's like, inevitably someone is going to get you to hold a gun, a weapon that has been used in a murder, drugs, or something. Just leave it in the trunk of your car until our next interview, and then I'll take it back from you. No. Don't involve yourself in crime to do research. And like in terms of initiation rights, you want to get people's trust without becoming part of the group. Different story if you're already part, I don't know. Let's say you were already part of, the member of a synagogue or a church or a mosque or something. You could go in and do research there and you're already part of that group. But you wouldn't want to be like, okay, I want to join, the Southside Serpents. That's the gang from Riverdale. It's not a real gang. What's that? I watched all of it but the last episode, and I couldn't bring myself to watch the last episode. So the first 2 seasons we watched because it was fun, and the subsequent 5 seasons my wife and I hate watched just relentlessly because it was so bad, and we would stop and like fall down laughing because the show was so hilariously bad. We had good fun with it until the 7th season where they went back to the 50s and then nothing made sense. I'm saying that as though this show ever made sense. Anyway, Riverdale notwithstanding. Yeah, you would never want to join the Southside Serpents to do research on them, but you could hang out with them, gain their trust. Maybe you have a member of the gang that that could introduce you in, and then they sort of acclimatize to you or something, right? But yeah, don't join a gang to do research on gangs. Inevitably, that is not okay. Follow-up question. The government? I mean...
People or something, it's about like a specific group or it's about some know about this? What can they do?
That's an interesting question. You know what? I should ask Sandra this particular question because she has spent a lot more time interviewing, like her whole, I think, PhD thesis was about Turkish gangs in Germany. She's German. But I don't know. I don't know what they could compel you to do legally, right? If like the police hauled you in and questioned you, and asked for your field notes. That's actually a really interesting question that I don't know the answer to. It just never crossed my mind. But I see her tomorrow, and I'll ask her if like your field notes could ever be like subpoenaed by the police and whether you have to give them in. I mean, probably, because in the sense like you don't have a sort of, this is going to be spitballing, but I will ask her and I'll see if I can get back to you on Wednesday. You don't have something like attorney-client privilege, like if you were a lawyer, where you have a sort of legal protection saying, you know, I'm duty-bound, or, you know, if you were a Catholic priest and you say the seal of the confessional forbids me from, Catholic priests legally don't have to disclose something that they heard during confession because it's a religious commitment. It's a whole thing. Neither here nor there, but you don't have a legal protection. I don't think as a researcher to be like, actually, that's part of my field notes and it's sacrosanct. You know, so I would say a good chance that if the police were like, hey, I heard you interviewed Donnie K. We'd really like to know what he said to you, and we would love to see your notes about it. You know, you might actually have to submit that. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I need the same right to disclosure as like say with psychologists, like if someone tells you that you do something terrible, like and you have to.
Yeah, so you have a duty to report. So I mean, obviously there's limits, right? So I mean, it's typically like harm to others, harm to minors. You have like a, you know, so I don't know if you were interviewing someone and they admitted to like rampant sexual abuse of their minor, you know, the person they're a guardian of, you absolutely have to report that. If they were, you know, they told you they were planning a terrorist bombing, you 100% have to go to the police and be like, for your information. But if they're like talking about self-harming themselves, like they're pondering suicide, I don't know that you have a duty to report that. So I may be being too granular, I don't know. But definitely if there's harm to a third party, especially minors, you have to report. You have the same, so you should put that in your informed consent letter. Yeah, John.
You have a duty to report if they threaten you, or
You have a duty to get the fuck out of there, is what you have a duty to. And of course, right, you can, sorry, I shouldn't swear, but you can go to the police and report that if you think it's severe enough. I would say like, you know, if you think that they're going to harm you and they might like continue to seek you out, absolutely. You can report that. You don't have to be like, well, you know, I might get murdered, but for the integrity of my research, I'm just gonna, no, obviously, you don't have to take threats that people give you. You don't have a duty to report, but you probably should. And there's nothing, you know, if someone openly threatens that they're gonna harm you, there's nothing protecting them from making threats within the research process, right? That's, you know, never okay. These are really interesting questions. So if someone has like a knife and they're like, and I'm interviewing them and they try to stab me, should I report that? Yes, you should. That would be bad not to do that. Okay, those are really interesting questions. I'm kidding a little bit. Okay. So obviously 2 categories of ethnography, overt and covert. Like by far, this is the more typical one now because covert research has a bit of a bad reputation. And research ethics boards are a little bit leery to approve it. So overt ethnography is where, you know, you present yourself as a researcher. People know that they're being studied and observed, and they know that you're there and they know what you're doing, right? And this can look like a lot of different things, but that is, you know, that's the major category. More often than not, you are presenting who you are, you know, in an open way, so that they know. Covert ethnography, all right, the people being studied don't know that they're being observed, and yeah, it has a lot of ethical concerns that overt ethnography doesn't. And so, you know, again, research ethics boards are are going to look at that deception as being problematic and probably push you towards an overt ethnography. Okay. These are just some examples, right? So some studies of kind of overt roles. This one always like weirds me out. Maybe it's because it's 1990. So in an open setting, right? Okay, well, let's go through like, so Toronto, Wilson's study of Toronto raves, right? Where basically Wilson went in and was wearing a name tag that said researcher, and it was pretty overt about what they were doing. Basically, you're in a rave, you're observing the behavior. It's an open setting, right? Anyone can go to a rave that has a ticket, but they were overt about what they were doing. And if anyone asked, they told them, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm here for. Totten's study of youth gang members was kind of similar, right? They told the youth gang members who they were. They presented themselves honestly. And I mean, this was usually out on the streets, right? It was just in street settings. They were open to it was just a public setting. But everybody kind of knew who they were. They presented themselves through intermediaries who introduced them to gang members on the street. Okay, this one always, like the number 3 one always weirds me out. Covert research in a public setting. DeRoche's updates on homosexual activity in public washrooms. So what's that? There had been a prior study done in the 70s that was a similar thing where they went to, I don't remember, it was public washrooms or rest stops on the, what's that? It was rest stops, yeah, like in California, I believe. And they observed, gay men, using this as a space to have sex in a kind of a safe-ish space, and wrote about it. And DeRoche did an update to it in 1990. Or I think the research was done in 1988 and published in 1990. Yeah.
How is that for people? Oh, it's in like rest stops because now they put people in danger now. Right?
I agree 100%, which is why I said this is a weird study. And I've never quite understood the ethics behind it, because it's like, you're not representing who you are. You're observing people, a subculture using this space. And then, if I recall, it's been a while since I read it, really careful to try and not identify people directly and just talk about the behavior, but still very odd, Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know how, again, the ethics of it have always to me been questionable. And honestly, you would never get away with this today. Yeah, no, totally. It's a little bit of an odd research interested behavior, which is why I said this one always weirds me out. Because I'm like, okay, but it's just an example of like, you're not identifying who you are. You're in this space. They don't know what you're doing there, and you're just observing them. It sounds so weird when you say it, right? It was to catalog how this particular sexual subculture behaved in a time where they faced a lot of social stigma, because they didn't have necessarily, in a lot of cases, spaces where they could be openly gay. They found these kind of quasi-public settings where you could be, like, if you're just an average person, you could be there for a legitimate reason, right? Maybe you're just going to this public restroom, but gay men used it as a particular kind of meeting place to have sex in. And it was like an observation of that particular subculture and the way they did things, to better understand the subculture, right? Now, yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. It wouldn't be research. I just hang out with furries, right? With consent, of course. Always consenting furries. No, I'm kidding, of course. I've never. What's that? No, about the furries. I would always get consent from furries, except I don't, because I don't hang out with them. And you can't prove otherwise. There are no photos. Okay. Sorry, I've taken this joke way too far. And yet I'll take it further. Okay. All right, so closed settings. So closed settings, this one, Carabanow, I think is how you pronounce it, did a study in 2002 of Canadian youth shelters, right? So they were let into youth shelters, and they did a participant observation in the youth shelters of the culture in there. Now, in that case, right, they had to get buy-in from the youth shelter, and the youth shelter workers were the ones that kind of told people who they were. And then the same thing with, I think I can't remember this research off the top of my head. I read it a while ago. I think they did this in kind of an Indigenous students kind of center, where they, basically went in and were allowed into this closed setting, again, telling people who they were, and allowed to observe what happened there. And then this last one, yeah. So this is another weird one. Covert research is always a little bit weird. So Heritage Front is I think a neo-Nazi group, and what is his name? Lauder did research on Heritage Front. I believe a lot of it was online, but basically sort of acted in a covert role looking at Heritage Front and their stuff. Now, because, it's a closed space, you had to gain access by essentially posing as a member of Heritage Front, because Heritage Front was never going to actually allow anyone to come in and observe things, because, neo-Nazi or white nationalist group, I can't remember what classification they fall under, basically misrepresented to get access, and then sort of observe the discussions going on and reported on them in the research. So that is an example of a covert kind of observation in a closed setting. Yeah, please.
So just kind of again,
Are you about to say that it's unethical to observe neo-Nazis?
no, just the illegal side of things. Because like let's say tomorrow they wanted to go somewhere, right? Not the I guess it's not legal. Like they go ahead and they just protest their ideas. You want to go there, and you're contributing to a pretty harmful thing, right? As people see you as one other person as a part of that crowd.
Right.
Right. So what is the extent to which you can go? Like January 6th, that's in the US.
Okay.
If you go there.
You're right.
So
what extent are you like not just observing, but you're just like biggest member?
Yeah, you're like contributing to it just even numerically in that sense.
If you went ahead and participated in these events, right, and you were there in person, and then you get to talk to other people that like organize things, and then you get a different view into the subculture that you wouldn't get at the bar.
Right.
How far can you go for your research purposes? Because, like, I don't think neo-Nazis would be like, yeah, okay, come sit with us, we'll start like talk to you about our organization and everything.
Seems unlikely.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're asking such searching and difficult questions. No, they're good questions, but I'm like, how far could you go? I mean, I think if you got this kind of research approved, you could go as far as doing anything illegal, right? The second you cross into the realm of illegality, I think you obviously run into problems.
So that's like the whole thing. Like, what's like the whole operation? Not operation.
So like if the group you join is illegal, I'm trying to think of what an illegal group would be, because like technically even gangs are not in theory illegal. It's the actions the members take within the gangs, right? I'm trying, like, I guess if you like actually the Nazi party in Germany is illegal, but I'm just trying, I can't think of what. Do you have an example?
I'm thinking the KKK. That would be illegal.
The KKK is not technically illegal, just I don't think, or just extremely frowned on and gross. But I think like, and obviously it's sort of fallen into disrepute, but it's just like it's an association. I know in the U.S. law there's freedom of association, right? You can associate with whoever you want. So yeah, I guess taking part in an illegal group would obviously be bad. But I think as long as you're not crossing, in a normal thing, if you wanted to like hang out with Heritage Front or something like it, as long as you yourself don't cross into illegality, as long as everything you're doing is technically legal, you would be okay. Now that might be a fine line, right? Because I don't know, you go to January 6th to protest and suddenly you're wearing bullhorns and stealing the speaker's podium, right? I'm not saying that guy was a researcher, obviously not, but maybe he's deep covert in terms of his research. Yeah, I think as long as you're not committing a crime, you'd probably be okay. And yeah, I mean, there might be an ethical concern with promoting the views of this group. It'd have to be like, is it worth finding out more about what happens in this group than the harm you're potentially doing in the abstract, right? Because you're not harming anyone directly, it's more of an indirect harm, I guess. Now, obviously, like if you start harming people directly, then you've crossed into a realm of, ethical wrongness and illegality that you probably shouldn't continue.
It was like, you want to do this cult, right? And then
You want to, sorry, can you say again?
you want to do research on cult, right?
Oh, people have done this.
Yeah, and you want to and you do that, you have to give membership. And then to give membership, you have to do something illegal.
You couldn't do it. No, you can't. Now, cults usually don't ask you to do anything illegal. Cults more, typically, it's like you need to swear off all of your social connections on the outside. There's usually an initiation ritual that's not usually illegal. But yeah, you definitely would not want to do something illegal. Yeah.
Can you give your research money to the cult? Because you have to pay them, right?
It depends on the cult, I guess. This is a really specific, very specific question.
How can your grant be used, right? It is
Query to Shirk. Can I use this money to join a cult? I'm going to guess no. I mean, Shirk has very specific reporting requirements as to what you do with the money. But you know what? Anything's possible, right? I wrote them a $50,000 check out of my research money to join a cult. It's phenomenal. Oh, cult stories. Okay. The amount of times cults have tried to recruit me is less than 10, but more than 5. Okay. Are you going to pick that up? There we go. How kind. Okay. Wow, you guys have such weirdly specific questions. Are you thinking of joining a cult and spending your research money? Because this is really not recommended. The chances of... Oh, okay. Okay. Because, honestly, cult is probably one of the more dangerous ones to kind of try and research, because they may really get to you at some point. And, especially if you do a participant observation, the more time you spend with them and the deeper your bonds with them, the more risk you're at of actually joining. But I only know this because I talk about religion all the time. Okay, 6 minutes. Why don't we just... No, you've gotten me so off topic. Why don't we start with access to closed settings? No, but off my slides. The topic, you're right, it was on topic, but just off my slides. And I feel like with 5 minutes left, the way back to the main path is going to be a little bit twisted. So, yeah, Joan has called the class, as she always does. She's told me I'm out of time. Oh, okay. Sorry, I shouldn't sigh. It's been a long day. Let's leave it at that. We'll pick it up on Wednesday. And again, if you want to look at your midterm, tomorrow is a good day to do it. Obviously, we have lots of time till the final still, so you'll be in good shape. And the final is non-cumulative, so you don't have to worry about the content from this midterm being on there. But if you want to take a look at it, do come by. If you let me know, I won't. I'll make sure I'm there when you come by. Sometimes I wander away to go buy something. But yeah, we'll leave it at that. Okay. We'll see you on